In 1991, two divers became trapped in a cave while scuba diving. Tragically, one of the divers did not make it out, but the actions he took just before his death saved the life of the other diver. This is the story of the Indian Springs cave diving tragedy. Indian Springs Cave is located in Florida, just south of Tallahassee. This area is now called Sherlock Springs and is a very popular outdoors area owned by the YMCA of Tallahassee. There are several cave systems in the area, including Sally Ward and Wakula Springs. However, because of the events that unfolded in 1991, Indian Springs is the most notorious. The Indian Springs Cave is still being explored to this day, but back in 1991, not much of the cave had been mapped. By 1991, the cave had been mapped to a large chamber named the Wakula Room. The plan on the first dive was to enter the Wakula Room and look for caves branching from this larger chamber. Because of the expected depth of the dive, decompression tables had been generated by Dr. R.W. Hamilton. These decompression tables were specific locations where gas tanks were staged so the divers could slow their ascent to prevent decompression sickness. The dive plan consisted of 3 phases: a 40-minute descent and transit, an exploration phase, and finally, a 40-minute transit to exit the cave. The exploration phase was a 20 to 25-minute exploration of the Wakula Room to find additional branching tunnels. On November 17, 1991, 2 experienced and well-equipped divers, Bill Gavin and Parker Turner, began their descent. Visibility was 60 feet. It was a perfect day for diving. They entered the water and traversed the entrance to Squaw's Restriction. This was a tight passageway that required attention, but not too worrying for these 2 experienced divers. They made their way to the Wakula Room, where they began their exploration phase. For the next 20 to 25 minutes, they explored the Wakula Room, finding no adjoining tunnels or evidence of flow. The deep portion of the dive was accomplished using double 104s mounted on the divers' backs, while the entrance and exit used 80 cubic feet stage tanks. This was a relatively long dive in deep water. As a diver goes deeper, the pressure increases. In order to maintain an equivalent internal lung pressure, the regulator provides air at an equivalent pressure as the water pressure surrounding the diver. As the diver goes deeper, the denser the air, and thus the more air they breathe. Because of the depth of the dive and the time required to explore the cave, the more air they need. Therefore, they planned 80 cubic foot stage tanks so they could use the double 104s for the exploration stage. Though the divers didn't find tunnels or indications of flow, Stage 1 and Stage 2 went as planned. At 63 minutes into the dive, the divers began their exit. The 2 divers reached their staged nitrox tanks at the top of the cave. At this point, they still had gas in their back-mounted double 104s, but switched to the extra tanks as planned. They continued traveling toward the exit. At approximately 1,500 feet from the exit, Parker's diver propulsion vehicle quit. This would delay their progress, but they were prepared. They tied a tow line from Gavin's DPV to Parker, and Gavin began to tow. They reached the upstream-downstream junction, which is about 500 feet from the entrance. Their bottom time, as estimated by Gavin, was 105 to 110 minutes. As they turned the corner to head back to the entrance, visibility was noticeably reduced. Previously, while Gavin and Parker were exploring in the depths, topside, an interesting event had occurred. The topside personnel had been waiting on the divers while conducting other dive experiments. All of a sudden, the water level in the basin dropped by about 1 foot, reversing the flow into the spring. Over the course of about 30 minutes, the water level had dropped and returned to its normal level. No one at the top level knew what had happened. Parker and Gavin were completely unaware of this topside event. They continued on making their way to the entrance as visibility continued to decrease. Once visibility reduced to just mere feet, they had to ditch the DPV and swim while pulling themselves along the main line leading them to the entrance. At first, The main line had been in clear water, even though the floor of the cave was completely obscured by silt. However, the closer they got to the entrance, the more into the silt the line became, until they could no longer pull the line. The line leading them to the cave entrance was completely buried. They tried to pull the line from the mud over and over again, to no avail. Gavin believed that they were very close to Squaw's restriction. They should be right on top of it. Instead, the tunnel ended and the line was buried. Gavin heard Parker yelling into his regulator, "What is this?" The divers backed out of this narrow area. Because their second bottles were out, they switched back to their back-mounted doubles. Gavin had 2,000 PSIG left. The divers noticed a second line running parallel to the line that was buried. They tried this one, but it was the same result. Both lines were buried and could not be pulled out. The divers had to stop using the DPV, as the visibility decreased to mere feet. Gavin attached a supplementary line to the permanent line so he could find a way back to this location, even though he didn't know exactly where this location was. The visibility was so low that they really didn't know where they were at all. Gavin swam back 300 feet to the arrow marker and deciphered where they were in the cave. When he swam back to the location where they had left the propulsion vehicle and the empty stage bottles, Parker was already there after searching on his own for an exit. Gavin and Parker had no idea why they were trapped, or what had happened to cause the entrance to no longer be there. They just knew that they couldn't see and they needed to get out. Parker showed Gavin his pressure, 400 PSIG. To put this in perspective, divers surface with at least 500 PSIG in their tanks as a reserve. Parker was now at 400, with no foreseeable way out of this cave. Parker pulled out his slate and wrote, "What do we do?" Gavin, having no idea, simply responded, "Hold on, I'll go look." They had already been looking. This was not reassuring. Gavin searched side to side for a way out for the next 5 minutes but found nothing. When he returned, Parker was gone. Gavin was down to 300 PSIG on his doubles and grabbed a stage that still had 600 PSIG. This ran out after about 4 minutes. With only a few minutes left, Gavin had one last-ditch effort to find a way out, and Parker was nowhere to be found. Gavin started back when he found a separate line that had been teed onto the main line. Without knowing how this line got there or where it went, Gavin decided that this was his best chance. As he was following this line, a second stage regulator caught his manifold and he turned to free it. When he turned, he looked up and saw the permanent line angled upward at a sharp angle. This was the exit. He swam to the decompression bottles hanging at 100 feet, later saying that he was nearly holding his breath as he reached them. Parker was not there. Because Parker had less gas than Gavin, Gavin knew at this point that Parker had drowned. Support divers had descended to assist Gavin. Parker's body was not found until the next day when visibility had reached at least 10 feet. After finding Parker's body and his tanks, the other divers were able to piece together what had happened. Parker teed in the line that Gavin had found. Parker must have found a small hole. Parker took off his doubles to squeeze through the hole. In doing so, he must have opened the hole wider so Gavin could fit with his tanks just a few minutes later. Parker must have known that he was almost to the decompression tanks, but ran out of gas just 30 feet short. He passed out, dropping his doubles, which caught on the main lines, and Parker floated to the top of the cave, where he was found the next day. Parker did not make it out, but the actions he took just before he died saved Gavin's life. The most widely accepted theory on what happened that day was developed by Doran Nof, Distinguished Professor of Physical Oceanography at Florida State University. The diver had begun to decompress, sending air bubbles to the top surface of the cave. The bubbles decreased the buoyancy, effectively increasing the weight of the rocks on the cave ceiling. These rocks broke loose, causing a landslide covering the entrance, blocking the exit to the cave. Indian Springs is still open to diving today, though it is highly regulated. The property is owned by the YMCA of Tallahassee, which uses it as a camp during summer months. Only permitted divers can dive here and only when camp is not in session. To this date, Parker Turner's death is the only non-diver air death in Indian Springs Cave. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.